Welcome back, and I would like to welcome next Koen Doens, Director General for International Partnerships, European Commission, and Heidi Hautala, Vice President of the European Parliament. After we hear from Koen Doens and Heidi Hautala, we will go straight to Francis West, Business Engagement Director at Shift, who will moderate our panel today. So, Mr. Doens, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning to some of you, wherever you are. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. I mean, I'm a Belgian. I'm also a European, but I'm also a Belgian. And as a Belgian, obviously, I have a specific affinity for chocolate. In fact, we Belgians, we sometimes find ourselves competing with our Swiss colleagues for the much coveted title of the world's best chocolate. Now, in the midst of COVID-19 and as the global inequalities that it has exposed, I believe actually that the title we really should be aiming for is the one of the world's most sustainable chocolate. And I'm actually hopeful that we can achieve that together for three reasons. First of all, because a common vision for sustainable cacao production is really emerging. Secondly, because a focus to create shared value is taking root. And thirdly, and importantly, because I think we see how clear incentives are at work to make us do that together. Now, obviously, to transform a global supply chain like cacao is a complex process. This being said, past experiences with other commodities, soya, beef, tell us that it is possible if private and public sectors work together. And that's why an event like the one you're having now, which promotes knowledge sharing, mutual exchanges, is so important. Over the past few months, actually more than a year, the European Union, with our partners, have launched an ambitious sustainable cacao initiative that aims to improve the economic, the social, and the environmental aspects of cacao production. The efforts basically build on a series of policy dialogues that we have convened between cacao producing countries and value chain stakeholders, called unsurprisingly, the Cacao Talks. These dialogues have been really important to help stakeholders build consensus and build that common vision that I was referring to. For instance, in Ghana, the EU has supported the National Regulatory Authority to set up multi-stakeholder platform to advance the national dialogue. Or in Côte d'Ivoire, we are supporting the government to develop their national strategy on sustainable cacao. Now, these talks that have been intense and interesting and very fruitful have generated a number of key takeaways. I mean, they've generated a number of, several takeaways, but there's basically 6 which I would like to highlight here. First of all, clearly the top priority is to ensure a decent living income for cacao farmers. It's the top takeaway that we have. Secondly, it's essential to promote sustainable agricultural production practices, especially in agroforestry. Thirdly, development cooperation and development finance will play an important role in transforming the sector. The fourth takeaway is that we need to agree on sustainability standards, and we need to set up transparent deforestation and child labor monitoring and cacao traceability mechanisms. The fifth takeaway is clearly that on the demand side, EU consumers are paying more and more attention to sustainable sustainability issues. And the sixth takeaway that came out of these talks is that when we look at upcoming EU regulations, and a very important one was adopted yesterday, that drive the agenda of sustainable cacao by linking it to the EU market, that this set of regulations that we're adopting and making that market link clearly present requirements and challenges, but mainly, if we get it right, real opportunities. Now, against the background of those takeaways that emerged from those Cacao Talks, we have been designing in parallel means and ways to walk the talk. Because we had taken from the start a clear commitment that we would act on these findings. And we're doing that with funding, we're doing that with legislation, and we're doing that with sharing of expertise and know-how. Maybe first on the funding. We started by allocating a 25 million euro package of budget support and technical assistance to implement some of these recommendations. And efforts are underway in Côte d'Ivoire, in Ghana, and in Cameroon. Now, that's a first step of a more comprehensive package of support that we will roll out over the next years as part of our new external budget for 2021-2027, which is being underpinned by an ever increasing, I would say, dialogue with all of you. So we will be designing the packages tuned to the needs, and the needs will be identified together with all of you. A key novelty of this approach is that we will deliver this as Team Europe. So when you're talking to us, it's not just about us, what we do at the EU level. We bring on board our member states, the EU member states, their development agencies, and their development finance institutions, so that we really create scale and that we really increase the impact of the kind of actions that we will identify together with you. There's already a very good example, and one of the Team Europe initiatives, as we call them, will be dedicated to bringing this kind of mass mobilization in Côte d'Ivoire on cacao, and we have another one that fosters green growth in Ghana. That's the funding part. Secondly, in parallel, we are working on regulations on deforestation. Important one was adopted yesterday, on sustainable finance, and on social corporate responsibility, so as to make sure that the actors of the value chains and the import products in the EU market are sustainable. I mean, private sector, civil society organizations have expressed an interest clearly in stronger laws to curb the environmental and the social impacts of products that are consumed on the EU markets. And so we are working in line with that expression of keen interest. We are working on those legislative proposals. My third point, and then the final one, is that these legislative initiatives, of course, will bring new standards, create new standards that will need to be met in order to guarantee access to the EU market, which I think is really more an opportunity, because together with these legislative measures and the financial packages that I refer to, we will deploy expertise, resources, know-how to work with partner countries and with the various actors across the value chain to make sure that you can, in a timely fashion, conform to these future standards. So what we're doing is really setting in motion, through funding, cooperation, know-how, expertise, and regulation, and all of that packaged in a real partnership approach, setting in motion something that is really, upping the standards and ultimately leading both from an economic, a social, and an economic point, and an environmental point of view, to a better value chain. I conclude by saying that the EU, being the world's largest importer of cacao, has a responsibility and is also uniquely positioned to play an active role in this kind of transition towards a fairer, more sustainable cacao production. I think the momentum, the political momentum for it is ripe. It's here right now. We've seen the political impetus coming out of the COP26 and building up again towards Kunming. We see how there is increasing evidence also of the business case to promote sustainability in the value chain. And clearly on the demand side, we see how European consumers are expressing increasingly expectations regarding how their chocolate is produced. So looking very much forward to continue the work that we're doing and that my teams are doing with all of you on this important initiative. And I hope that the debates that will follow in the panel just now will be very fruitful. Thank you very much.
Dear participants, I am glad and honored to be able to speak today, even if to my regret I cannot be present due to my parliamentary commitments. I go straight to the most important point. We are all well aware that this decade is the make it or break it for the planet and humanity. Biodiversity crisis and climate crisis are here now, and poverty of so many people on this planet. The climate deal reached at the COP26 last weekend is described as too late for vulnerable countries, but too much for others. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that important steps are being taken, but unfortunately the collective political will was not enough. I have also seen different kind of assessments, which I fully agree with as well. The green transition accelerates, and every CEO must understand that the private sector needs to be ready. Indeed. Food production is a major threat to the world's forests and to climate. It is land intensive and causes land conversion and deforestation. This is particularly true for meat and dairy production, but also the cocoa sector knows these problems very well, and we have been discussing this together for many years. In order to fight global deforestation and biodiversity loss, the EU has taken a close look at responsible consumption and production, namely the Sustainable Development Goal, SDG number 12. And while we talk of deforestation and biodiversity loss, it's crucial to bear in mind that sustainability is an integrated concept. Human rights are an inseparable part of environmental sustainability. Under the EU Green Deal, the EU will soon publish its proposal for a legislation that applies to all companies operating in the EU internal market. This proposal on sustainable corporate governance includes mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. This proposal is expected to be firmly anchored in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which were unanimously adopted a decade ago. So now is the time for real implementation. This piece of EU legislation has the role to ensure that companies and their entire global value chains are free of adverse impacts on human rights, labor rights, and the environment. In the coming days, we are also expecting a proposal on deforestation regulation, specifically on forest risk commodities. Companies will have the obligation to ensure that the products imported into the EU and placed in the EU internal market have been sustainably produced. Legislation is just one part of the solution. The author of the UN Guiding Principles, a visionary of business and human rights, the late Professor John Ruggie, underlined that corporate responsibility is at its best when it's a smart mix of different means. This means that the EU mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence or deforestation regulation on forest risk commodities will never be enough on their own. Alongside legislation which brings the whole of private sector on the same line, industry and sector initiatives and voluntary cooperation between companies and other stakeholders will also be needed in the future. In this regard, I have been a huge fan and supporter of the EU multi-stakeholder platform on sustainable cocoa ever since it started roughly a year ago. When I speak in public, I often use it as an example on how the EU should draft its policies, not just on cocoa, but also on other sustainability risk commodities. Best solutions are
Welcome everyone to this this session on the potential incoming due diligence measures at EU level and their implications for people and planet, specifically in cocoa value chains. So my name's Francis West. I've got the honor of moderating this panel. I work for an organization called Shift. We're a not-for-profit center for expertise on business and human rights. And we exist to put the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights into practice. And we've been working over the last 18 months with civil society, business and governmental stakeholders on the legislative proposal at the EU, that the EU Commission is intending to bring forward on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence as part of the EU Sustainable Corporate Governance Initiative. Now, to discuss this topic, we've got an esteemed panel. I'm delighted to introduce Isabel Adam from Touton, Julia Christian from Fern, Ambassador Abu Dosso from Côte d'Ivoire, and Regis Meritan from DG International Partnerships. Now, before we turn to our panelists for their thoughts, I just want to frame up our conversation here. So as you'll have heard in Heidi Hautala's intervention just a moment ago, there are various intersecting efforts to enhance responsible business practice that are being carried out at EU level. Now, our main focus today in this session is on the DG Just driven process, which looks to introduce that duty on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence for all companies operating in the single market. There was a consultation on options for this legislation earlier in the year, and it's thought that the Commission will publish its proposal on this in December. And the EU Parliament has already put forward its view on the shape of that this legislation should take. Now, separately, as you will no doubt be aware, DG Environment yesterday published its regulation on products entering the single market linked to deforestation, and that targets 6 agricultural products: beef, soy, palm oil, coffee, cocoa, and timber. And at the same time, the Commission has proposed a corporate sustainability reporting directive. And of course, there are also have been soundings on discussions around a potential EU import ban on goods made with forced labor. So there's a great deal going on at the moment, and a good time to be discussing this. So while we don't know precisely what the proposed EU duty on mandatory due diligence will look like, there's been a consensus throughout this debate amongst those involved that any such duty should be built on the global standard of business conduct in relation to human rights, the UN Guiding Principles. They were, of course, unanimously endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011. They're reflected in industry practice, in standards like the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises, and increasingly in hard law. Now, the guiding principles are clear that states shouldn't assume that businesses prefer or benefit from state inaction, and that they should consider a smart mix of measures, national, international, mandatory, and voluntary, to foster business respect for human rights. So that concept of mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence is absolutely in line with the UN guiding principles. But it's also important to remember that other non-mandatory measures that have been worked on so much over the last decade are still relevant and are going to play a significant role. Now, at their core, the guiding principles is this concept of the human rights due diligence process. It is essentially a risk management approach that looks across the whole value chain and focuses on risk to people, not risks to business, but risks to people. It involves assessing the negative impacts that your business has on people, acting on those findings, tracking the effectiveness of those interventions, and communicating them about them to stakeholders who need to know. And at every stage of that process, engagement with affected stakeholders, so those that are at risk of negative impacts, should inform this process. Now, what are some of the implications of trying to align this legislation with the concept of human rights due diligence in the guiding principles? Well, human rights due diligence is not simply about doing no harm at the operational level. It's about considering human rights risks at governance and strategic level. It's not a tick box exercise that's disconnected from outcomes on the ground. It involves meaningful engagement with affected stakeholders. And it is also about how a company may cause or contribute to a harm, including via purchasing practices. So there's a reflection on, a company's business model, the way that you structure your value chain, the way that you might incentivize or facilitate harm occurring at the hands of a business partner. And it's not just about risk assessment, it's about creative leverage in linkage situations far down the value chain, individually and in collaboration with others. And it's also about whether remedy is actually being provided to those harmed. So where you find you have impacted someone's human rights, that should be put right as a matter of course. And many businesses that are already implementing that international standard are actually proactively calling for the EU to introduce legislation in line with the guiding principles. So back in December 2019, a small group of cocoa companies and NGOs were amongst the first to call on the EU to develop more robust due diligence, specifically in relation to this commodity. A DG Just commissioned report again highlighted significant business support. And then in September of 2020, you had 26 companies and associations there calling on the EU to introduce such legislation. That's matched by investor support, and then a number of business associations, Responsible Business Alliance, Amfori, AIM Progress, and again, the Voice Network of cocoa companies and NGOs recently came out again with a very detailed position on what this legislation could look like. Great to see that business support, because I think if we get this legislation right, we can drive better quality human rights due diligence. It can make sure that we're preventing impacts from occurring in the first place. We can ensure that remedies provided as part of a company's internal processes when impacts do occur, and then of course when it's not, there may well be a new route to remedy for complainants. But to do all that, we need to make sure that the law is shaped and enforced in the right way, and that's what we're here to discuss today. So let me stop sharing and come straight to you, Regis. Specifically in relation to cocoa, what has the Commission been doing to help different stakeholders prepare for these new frameworks?
Well, many thanks, and good morning or good afternoon to everybody. Let me maybe shortly recall where we are coming from. We are coming from a situation 5 years ago, 16, 17, when the prices of cocoa were very, very low. We tried within the ICCO framework, where we are representing, the EU is representing all the member states, so consumer countries. We tried to organize something in Brussels to discuss about this issue, and it was so difficult. It was so difficult. Producer countries were accusing industry to have some hidden agreement and that was resulting in low prices. On the industrial side, it was very difficult to discuss about the issue of prices, and nothing moved until, I would say, 2019, when, together with Ghana, Ivory Coast, when they launched, when the industry signed this agreement on the living income differential. At that time, we thought it might be the opportunity to really start talking seriously about sustainability, because sustainability has a cost. And we had that feeling that we were in a position to play a kind of role of honest broker, explaining that we were ready to support this initiative on a higher price for cocoa if that was a different product, a sustainable product. And immediately afterwards, or some months afterwards, with the new commission in 2020, this very strong focus and international focus on environmental issues, on what we call the Green Deal, was a kind of, for us, of alignment of stars, saying, look, now we have to do something, and most likely cocoa appears as a low-hanging fruit. And that corresponds to the time 1 year ago where we launched the Cacao Talks. The first thing I think we did, and after 1 year after the launch of the Cacao Talks, I do think that we have contributed to establish a climate of trust, that we have improved the trust between all stakeholders. We have the feeling that now that the regulations, not only the one on sustainable corporate governance, but as well the one which was published yesterday as a proposal, of course, to be discussed with member state and parliament. Now that we have this proposal, we do have the feeling that the work which has been done during the past year has probably paved the way for really turning these new regulations into an opportunity. An opportunity just because it will allow us to all agree on the fact that we need a new product, and that because it's a new product, it will be possible to increase the revenues of the farmers of the countries. But for that, we have to define altogether what will be the specifications of this new product, in order that this new cocoa product will be in compliance with the European legislation the day they will be enforced. We have a bit of time for that, as you all know, but we have no time to continue and to strengthen the dialogue we started to put in place. When talking about changing that into an opportunity, very shortly, the aim of this legislation, and in particular the one on deforestation, is the following. Not anymore there will be a new big producer countries starting a significant cocoa production from the destruction of a forest, which is unfortunately the history of agriculture and the history of forest. So, in other words, those countries who are the leaders of cocoa production today, if they turn their existing production into a 100% sustainable production, they will get a definitive comparative advantage compared to other countries non-producing cocoa today or producing small quantities of cocoa. And this is this opportunity which must be seized. And of course, I was explained by the Director General Koen just before, with the Cacao Talks, with the bilateral dialogue we have launched at country level, we are fully in, and all stakeholders can count on the EU to support them into this pathway.
Super. Thank you very much, Regis. That's very good to hear. And Julia, I want to come to you now. It's great to hear about the dialogue that's that's been going on there, but I think still there's probably been a larger amount of discussion at the EU level, not necessarily just within the Commission, but within NGO groupings and businesses. But of course, these different types of legislation are meant to shape better outcomes for farmers and ecosystems in value chains outside of Europe. And so how can this sort of legislation do that?
Thanks. It's a great question. It's something we've been thinking about a lot. I'll just start by saying that we're extremely excited about the deforestation regulatory proposal that just came out yesterday. It's something that NGOs, including mine, I think we've been pushing for it for about 8 years. So it's really, really exciting to see something come out. And although there are things that need to be improved, I think the basis is strong and it's something to work with. So indeed, it's a big opportunity and we're really happy about that. So as you said, I think for us, it's key, and I think it's missing a bit from the objectives of the regulation at the moment. The point of the regulation shouldn't just be to clean up EU supply chains. It should be to use EU market sort of power and access as a leverage to improve production across the board, including production that's headed to other markets like the US. And in fact, I think that the dialogue that Regis has just been talking about is part of that. And I think that what we would really like to see, I'm going to mention two things. First is partnership agreements, and the second is addressing the low cocoa price. So on the partnership agreements, this is something we've been asking for a while as well. We would like to see the EU and producer countries negotiate partnership agreements that would result in roadmaps that sort of set out concretely what needs to happen, both in producer countries and consumer markets, to ensure that cocoa is able to comply with the new EU regulations. And this should really be looking at, like I said, addressing issues across the board, not just in supply chains headed towards the EU, but really looking at national governance issues. These roadmaps, the way they're developed is very important. It's very important that they really have proper participation from farmers and from civil society in producer countries, as well as governments and companies that more frequently get to influence policy. And the deforestation regulation, we were pleasantly surprised to see the proposal that was published yesterday does contain an opportunity for this. mentions agreements between the EU and producer countries whose object would be to facilitate compliance with the regulation, and which, if implemented, could give the country a lower risk rating in the country benchmarking system that the regulation creates. So that's really an opportunity. I think that in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, I could imagine that such an agreement could provide support to these national traceability systems that those countries are developing, which is a really positive development, and I think is already on the cards. It also needs to look at other issues of national policy, like tenure, like law enforcement, like cooperative governance, that might risk to undermine the national traceability system or other sort of efforts to tackle deforestation and human rights issues. And then finally, such an agreement should really focus on smallholders and how to support smallholders to comply with the regulation. That's going to be a challenge, and also an opportunity. So it should be at the heart of these agreements. And so once both the EU regulatory proposals are published, we have one now. It was published yesterday on deforestation. I hear the one on the human rights due diligence will be published next month. And so once both of those are published, I really would very strongly and genuinely advise the governments of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire and the EU and any other cocoa producing countries to really sit down together and look at what's in those regulatory proposals, identify what are the gaps with how things are currently happening in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire and what needs to happen to close that gap, and really get the support of Team Europe to close those gaps. I think this is a joint project, and we have a few years. You know, the regulation will probably come into force around, well, it depends how long it takes to agree, but we have a few years to get ready, maybe 3-4 years. So I really would urge all the parties to use that time well. It's really in your interest. So we really hope to see this dialogue turn into an agreement with these sort of actions in there. The second thing I'd mention, which would help sort of broaden the impact of the regulation beyond just the EU supply chains, is to look quite directly at addressing the low and unstable price of cocoa. The right to an adequate standard of living is a human right, and the very low price and unstable price farmers are paid for cocoa in West Africa is driving systemic violations, both of this right and of children's rights. There are obviously multiple factors to this. We definitely do need to look at supply management in producer countries, and I understand there's a conversation starting around this, which is positive. But I really would like to see, since we're on a WCF call, more active acknowledgement by companies. Firstly, that the low price that they pay is a driver of human rights abuses in the cocoa sector. Secondly, a recognition that it's within their power to do something about it. And thirdly, that they finally actually pay an adequate price to farmers. Benchmarks on adequate price exist. They're out there. Companies should be paying it, full stop. It's that simple. So, and I think a place where we need to look, which is maybe new, and I don't have clear thinking on it yet, is to also look at the role that consumer governments play in keeping the price low. What role does regulation or lack of regulation or subsidy and tax structures have in keeping commodity prices low generally? I think it's not specific to cocoa, but I think it includes cocoa. And I think that's something that I would like to look more into next year, and I'm planning to do so.
Super. Thank you very much, Julia, for that. So moving from a civil society perspective to business view, Isabel, we've heard quite a lot about the deforestation regulation there, but coming back to focus on the potential environmental and human rights due diligence requirement that may be forthcoming in December. How can such a requirement be constructed to ensure effective due diligence?
Thank you, Francis, and thank you to WCF for inviting me to offer an industry perspective on this topic. Good afternoon to all. Francis, as you've already stated, the cocoa and chocolate industry has already publicly voiced its support for European due diligence legislation. We believe it can contribute to a competitive level playing field. It can increase legal certainty about the standards expected from companies to respect human rights and the environment, and it can clarify legal consequences for when responsibilities are not met. Importantly, and I understand we will come back to this later, due diligence processes should help to trigger and incentivize impactful and effective actions on the ground. Now, we believe there are a few key principles that need to be fulfilled for due diligence to deliver on establishing a level playing field and achieving sector-wide change. The first is legal certainty. Measures should be designed to encourage companies to develop adequate systems and not to disengage from high-risk areas. At member state level, government enforcement agencies should monitor companies' performance, including the design, adequacy, and implementation of their due diligence systems, which implies that member states' competent authorities must be provided with the correct mandate, financial and human resources, and expertise to monitor compliance in order to help develop due diligence as a predictable standard. The second is the need for sector-specific guidelines to take into account the specificities of different supply chains, such as the cocoa supply chain. The third is obviously the need for clear measurable minimum standards. Due diligence legislation and accompanying sector-specific guidelines will have to clearly spell out measurable minimum standards that a company has to implement in order to be considered compliant with due diligence requirements. When it comes to enforcement, as spelled out in the United Nations Guiding Principles, companies should be held liable for failure to establish and maintain a reasonable due diligence process that respects minimum standards stipulated by the legislation and guidelines, or for knowingly making false or misleading statements about their processes. And penalties for failing to do so should be proportionate and dissuasive. There is also a need for rights and obligations to be matched to appropriate and effective remedies when breached, which implies the need for companies to have operational level grievance mechanisms that are accessible to stakeholders to help provide early stage resolution of problems. We can come back to that later. Finally, in respect to reporting obligations, due diligence guidelines should also take into account that transparency in reporting should not be used against companies, and a distinction has to be made between what a company can influence and what it cannot currently control. As the UN Guiding Principles themselves acknowledge, even with the best policies and processes in place, companies may not be able to prevent all negative human rights and environmental impacts straight away. So due diligence should be seen as a continuous dynamic process of improvement to progressively strengthen and deepen responsible actions based on ongoing risk assessments and impact-oriented approaches. Julia has already touched on this, but in addition to the specifics of mandatory due diligence processes, any regulation or legislation should be developed as part of a smart mix of mutually reinforcing measures that foster business respect for human rights and the environment. As stipulated in the Deforestation Regulation proposal, it's also important that EU policymakers continue to engage in dialogue with the producing countries and other stakeholder groups and look at different policies, mechanisms, and systems that need to be strengthened to deliver on due diligence. First and foremost, this includes support in developing mandatory government-owned traceability systems in producing countries, but also reinforcing policies on land and forest governance, including land tenure and tree rights, agricultural and rural policies, including land use planning and supply management measures, policies that support child protection and the prevention of child labor and improve their access to basic services, such as education, healthcare, water, and better nutrition. And of course, strengthen capacity of enforcement agencies to enforce existing laws and prosecute illegal activities locally for all of the above. And it also means, and this comes back also to the comment Régis Mariton was making earlier about this new product we are all aiming to co-design. It also means working to align the regional standard for sustainable cocoa, so it meets the requirements of due diligence systems. We strongly believe many of those points can be addressed through the development of partnership agreements and/or sector-specific deliberations outlined in sectoral guidelines. Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much, Isabel. That's a lot to chew on there. Now, I want to come to the perspective of producer governments here and come to you first, Ambassador Dosso. So how can the requirement or the likely requirement on EU companies to carry out environmental and human rights due diligence, how can that best be shaped to support producer country efforts to drive better outcomes for people and the environment?
Merci beaucoup, merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. I would like to thank the World Cocoa Foundation for this amazing panel and for the sustainability of cacao. As far as supply chains go, we have to guarantee the deforestation and the work, children's Thank you very much. The interpreter could not hear. Thank you very much. This is a priority to help with child labor. So as the first producer and the export of cacao to the European Union, we want to make sure that there's due diligence as far as human rights and everything that could harmonize in the entire continent of Europe. However, it is important that these regulations and the companies have good behavior so that they can put it in place, so that the practice is efficient, starting with the supply chains and the producers of cacao. As you already know, all the big groups use their due diligence, their corporate due diligence currently. So there is the protection of human rights and environment. That is a reality. And this has been going on for 20 years. But it is this corporate due diligence that was not motivated by, was not really conforming to legislation. That was not the case. But we know that there was a risk of their reputations. They were scared that their names, that their brands would be linked to problems of human rights or environment. That's clear. But we have to understand that these companies with the due diligence have really only fixed one problem. But they did not contribute to fixing the right problem, child labor, deforestation, and that is why we continue talking about it. And we're going to talk about it again. It is clear for us. So we have to learn from all these lessons of this due diligence, corporate due diligence, and avoid making the same mistakes. And one of the main errors is the insufficient implication from producing countries and the Commission. Commission understood that and decided with the dialogue that they opened has effectively given the voice to everyone to speak. And I think that the engine would be with the partnership. That means collaboration, exchanges, taking into consideration the impact and the measures that are taken by other partners. That goes both ways, sorry. That is important. The nature of the relationship of the European Union and other states has changed. We went from developing countries to partners. The change that went from development and cooperation went to the international partners to a perfect administration. So we have to include in legislation, we have to leave room for dialogue, and it already started well. So we also welcome the Cacao Talks. That is a dialogue and exchanges that has created so many original ideas, and especially it has given voice, like I said earlier, to the producing countries. So through Cacao Talk has really showed the initiative by European Union has proved to work on the international level. These Cacao Talks also showed that the rights of cacao producers have gained human dignity, and that this is a human rights. The ability to be able to live from your own production, to live from your work, that is a human right. And I pinpointed this many times during this declaration, because we all know that poverty of these farmers is directly linked to child labor and deforestation. And so we have to face these problems immediately. We have to avoid blaming commerce and agricultural world. As a matter of fact, the national traceability by all stakeholders, and we cannot ignore these problems and the integration of these people in these problems. So my country is not going to wait for the European Union to start the fight against deforestation and child labor. We would like to, the European Union will not contradict these rules. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. So thank you very much for that, Ambassador. Ambassador Senna, can we now come to you, please? And same perspective, really. What would you, as a producer government, like to see from the EU as it develops this legislation?
Thank you very much, Francis, and good afternoon to all panelists and participants. You know, the government of Ghana is, I must say from the outset, is supportive of this legislation that the EU is proposing to release at the end of the year. But what we would like to see, yes, it is important for the EU to frame the regulatory requirements in a manner that will ensure the consumer businesses in their bid to attain or satisfy the higher environmental and human rights standards, they do not push the costs of meeting buyer requirements down to the cocoa producer. That is, in the first instance, what we would like to see in the legislation. And then if this issue is not addressed, then the economic pressures generated by stricter mandatory or buyer-driven environmental requirements could see a worsening of the working conditions and increased use of child labor, which in the cocoa sector, which we are trying to eschew. So you see that initial research suggests that one of the effects of the economic pressures generated by the COVID-19 pandemic, it has sought to undermine the progress on eliminating child labor. Some progress have been made, but this is being eroded because of the times that we are in. So the timing of this legislation must also take into account the happenings in this in our world now. We are not in normal times. So Ghana is also hoping that the EU will take this situation into consideration. Timelines for certain things may not be met because we are all resetting our developmental agendas. Governments are struggling, the citizenry are also trying. So the legislation must take all these things into consideration. So in our search for a solution to deal with environmental and human rights challenges in a manner that will be sustainable at the farm level, then consideration of the farm level economic pressures generated by the way cocoa markets currently function, the futures market, it must ensure that the issue of fair distribution of earnings along the cocoa supply chains is placed at the center stage of the new policy. Now, the governments of Ghana, together with our brotherly peoples of La Côte d'Ivoire, have sought to come to get to grips with the issue. And this is why we have introduced the Living Income Differential Initiative. It is our belief that through the LID initiative, sound economic foundations can be laid at the producer level for addressing shared environmental and human rights concerns. So the crux of the matter, however, is we need the EU regulatory initiatives to support our efforts in this area, not to be punitive, specifically by helping stop companies from circumventing the living income differential levy. Otherwise, corporate practices could see not only our efforts to raise producer living standards in the cocoa sector undermined, but also ongoing efforts to ensure more environmentally sound and socially just business practices adopted across the cocoa sector go to naught. I want to acknowledge at this point the EU regulatory initiatives and the need that is seen and what we have seen in the EU just transition. The Commission has spoken out in its July 2021 Fit for 55 plan to achieve its climate targets. And yes, Ghana does acknowledge this and appreciates it. But more fundamentally, however, if we keep on circumventing the LID, then the EU due diligence requirements will not work. So it has to be made sort of obligatory for cocoa cocoa that is used in the cocoa products placed for sale on the EU market to be sourced from countries which implement the LID initiative or similar minimum producer price requirements. And this is something that I've seen that Tesco is doing with bananas. They have sought to incentivize banana farmers the banana product that is bought from farmers who are being properly paid. So this is something that we should bring into the cocoa sector as well. And it is fundamental that we look at the LID as the most crucial thing for this, for realizing the environmental and humanitarian rights.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Forgive me.
I'm just ending. The human rights of the farmer must also be looked at. Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much for that. And I do apologize for our time. Our time is a little shorter than we'd anticipated. So brevity is going to be key here. Isabel, the ambassador talks about socially just business practices. What are the sorts of on-the-ground practices, behaviors, and system strengthening interventions that need to be incentivized?
Okay, I'll try and to make this short because I appreciate that a lot could be said about this. So I did just want to come back very, very briefly on some of the discussions that took place yesterday. And I think several speakers eloquently emphasized that the fact that due diligence frameworks and processes are useful and important tools, but should not equate, and these are not my own words, to a bureaucratic exercise. And we should not lose sight of the development agenda, and I'm coming to your question, that is necessary to assess risk and to put in place the right systems and safety nets on the ground to prevent negative environmental and social impact. One also needs to incentivize some of the long-term interventions and systemic changes that are needed if we are to reach these responsible and sustainable supply chains. So I'd also want to come back on the fact that we need to work collectively. There is a lot to do. And everyone has a role to play, and we take our responsibility as industry. But I think we all need to collectively work on the resilience agenda in a more holistic perspective. So this means listening to farmers' needs and priorities through inclusive and participatory consultation. It means, and I take all the points that have been made to date and also during other discussions on the living income agenda in the wider sense. I think we need to continue to foster and accelerate farmer organization and empowerment for them to be able to have a true voice in a lot of the discussions that are taking place. We need to continue supporting farmers in adopting production systems to increase their resilience to climate change. We know that climate change ultimately will also lead potentially to human rights issues. But that also means continuing to work on alternative crops and income streams. It means supporting communities and farmers in accessing finance, but also ensuring that the right social safety nets are in place locally for mediation and redress. Partnerships and collaborations, I think, continue to be key to achieving scale and impact. And that means collaborating and building the most efficient traceability systems. It means partnering on activities and interventions on the ground, but it also means partnerships in respect to monitoring progress, but also in respect to data collection and data sharing. Thanks.
Super, Isabel, thank you, and really appreciate you keeping that precise and very useful. But Julia, we've heard a lot. Actually, what I'm hearing there is that there is quite a lot of consensus on where we're driving to. But there are some sticking points, I believe, and I'd be interested in understanding what civil society's perspective is on those sticking points in relation to these pieces of legislation.
Yeah, sure. I might focus on two because we don't have much time. One is civil liability. I think there's a big risk that in both regulations it drops out. In an earlier draft of the Deforestation Regulation had a civil liability provision. The published proposal does not. I understand it's also under attack in the other proposal. we really need dissuasive consequences for non-compliance. It's so easy to design a regulation that puts fines or sort of administrative sanctions in place, and it's so easy for companies of this size to simply absorb those into the cost of doing business. It happens quite often. It happens with existing regulations. It's really in no one's interest to have a regulation that doesn't contain dissuasive enforcement mechanisms and that doesn't really push people into compliance. I think it's something I'm definitely quite concerned about in both regulations. If we have a regulation without strong enforcement mechanisms, it's useless. So I hope that we can overcome differences in this respect and come to consensus about the importance of civil liability that also isn't full of sort of caveats and exceptions, which is how the discussions might be at the moment. The second thing, which is I think going to be a point of contention, is it's really important in both regulations that all companies and all parts of the supply chain are covered. If you create exemptions for smaller or medium-sized companies or for parts of the supply chain that are further away from the company and further towards the farm, which is really at a risk in both regulations, you're missing out on a lot of the cocoa sector, because a lot of the cocoa sector is SMEs and a huge proportion of the cocoa supply chain is indirect. So if you sort of carve out exemptions like this, it hugely lessens the impact of the regulation. So I really hope that we haven't seen sort of any industry lobbying on these questions, but I certainly hope that we wouldn't, because I do think there's a lot of consensus, as you say, and I do really think there's a genuine desire to make it work. So I'm happy we have an open dialogue with industry on these questions, and I hope that we can come to agreement on these.
Super, Julia, thank you. And I'm just conscious we have less than a minute left, but Regis, I wanted to come back to you, you know, and just ask, hearing what you've or digesting what you've heard so far, are there any final reflections on how you might move forward? Yeah, great to hear your final thoughts. You're on mute, I'm afraid, Regis.
How to move forward? First, deepen the dialogue. The trust which has been built is now, I think, a real asset. Now it will be time with the regulation. We know more or less what will be the regulation, at least the main point on the deforestation. We will have soon the same visibility on the regulation on sustainable corporate governance. It's now, as Julia was saying before, time to work all together to develop these partnerships. There will be probably room for using existing agreements, maybe new agreements. I'm thinking about the Economic Partnership Agreement, for instance, or other type of agreements. We have to facilitate, in fact, the effective implementation of the due diligences. So we have to build an ecosystem which is as favorable as possible, to make the life of those in charge of producing this due diligence as easy as possible for the benefit of all stakeholders, again, with the first concern of the revenue of farmers.
And with that, I think we'll close it out. Fine words there, and we hope to see many more of these discussions as the different requirements come into play. So thank you very much to all of the panelists. Really appreciate your efforts and time and your willingness to squeeze in your key points. Thank you.